Napoleon Bonaparte was born into rejection. The year was 1769, and Corsica had just been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France. His father, Charles Bonaparte, had fought fiercely for Corsican independence under the rebel leader Pasquale Paoli. But when the French conquered the island, Charles made a calculated decision that would scar his son's psyche forever. He switched sides and embraced French rule. To 9-year-old Napoleon, this wasn't just political pragmatism, it was betrayal. The boy watched his father abandon everything he had claimed to believe in, trading Corsican pride for French titles and social climbing. In Napoleon's developing brain, this created a fundamental fracture in trust. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes social pain and moral violations, would have fired intensely during these early experiences of perceived betrayal and abandonment. When Napoleon was sent to military school in mainland France at age 9, the neural damage deepened. He arrived speaking broken French with a thick Corsican accent. His classmates immediately marked him as different, foreign, inferior. They mocked his pronunciation, his customs, his heritage. In the hierarchical world of military academy, he became an outsider, a target for ridicule and social exclusion. Neurologically, this chronic social rejection was devastating to a developing brain. The posterior superior temporal sulcus, which processes social belonging, became hyperactive as young Napoleon constantly scanned for signs of acceptance or threat. The amygdala, already sensitized by his father's betrayal, grew increasingly reactive to any hint of disrespect or dismissal. But here's where Napoleon's brain began its remarkable adaptation. Instead of withdrawing into depression or learned helplessness, his neural circuits chose a different path. The ventral striatum, which processes reward and motivation, began associating achievement with survival. If he couldn't belong through birth or heritage, he would belong through excellence. If he couldn't be loved for who he was, he would be feared and respected for what he could accomplish. This neurological rewiring explains the obsessive studying that marked Napoleon's school years. While other boys played games and formed friendships, he consumed military histories with manic intensity. His prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and long-term planning, was being trained to see knowledge as power and power as the only reliable form of security. The constant isolation also had another crucial effect on his developing brain. Without consistent peer relationships to practice empathy and social reciprocity, the neural pathways responsible for understanding others' perspectives remained underdeveloped. This wasn't sociopathy. Napoleon could feel deeply, as his later relationships would prove. Instead, it was a form of emotional tunnel vision, where other people became instruments in his grand designs rather than fully realized human beings with their own needs and feelings. The shame of his Corsican origins created another lasting neurological imprint. The insula, which processes feelings of disgust and self-contempt, became hyperactive whenever Napoleon encountered reminders of his humble beginnings. This explains his lifelong obsession with erasing traces of his past. He would later change the spelling of his name from the Italian Buonaparte to the French Bonaparte. He commissioned paintings that portrayed him as noble and regal, always hiding the physical insecurities that plagued him from childhood. At military school, Napoleon's teachers noted something remarkable and disturbing. The boy who was mocked and excluded during social hours transformed completely in the classroom. His mind absorbed tactical concepts with frightening speed. He could visualize complex battlefield scenarios in 3 dimensions, moving imaginary armies across imaginary terrain with an intuitive grasp that amazed his instructors. This cognitive gift wasn't random, it was his brain's adaptation to powerlessness. The dorsal attention network, responsible for focused concentration, had been strengthened through years of forced isolation. While other children developed their social cognition through play and interaction, Napoleon's neural resources were redirected toward spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and strategic thinking. His brain was literally rewiring itself to find power through intellectual dominance. The humiliation of his accent created another crucial adaptation. Napoleon began speaking less and listening more, observing the subtle social dynamics that he couldn't naturally navigate. This hypervigilance to social cues would later serve him well in reading the motivations and weaknesses of political opponents. The temporoparietal junction, which processes social information and theory of mind, became unusually active as he learned to decode human behavior like a military cipher. But perhaps the most significant neurological change was happening in his reward system. Most children derive pleasure from peer acceptance, shared laughter, and social bonding. Napoleon's dopamine pathways were being trained to fire not for social connection, but for intellectual victory, for moments when he could prove his superiority over those who had rejected him. The nucleus accumbens, the brain's pleasure center, was learning to associate triumph over others with the deepest feelings of satisfaction and relief. This created a dangerous psychological pattern. Napoleon was becoming addicted to dominance. Each small victory in the classroom provided temporary relief from the chronic stress of social rejection, but it also reinforced the neural pathways that equated personal worth with power over others. The prefrontal cortex, still developing and malleable, was encoding a fundamental life equation. Respect equals fear, and fear requires constant demonstration of superiority. The isolation also warped his understanding of loyalty and friendship. Because he had experienced so little genuine acceptance, Napoleon's brain developed an almost paranoid vigilance for signs of betrayal. The anterior insula, which processes trust and social bonding, remained underdeveloped, while the amygdala's threat detection systems grew hyperactive. This meant that even when people did show him kindness or respect, part of his brain remained suspicious, always scanning for ulterior motives or potential abandonment. Years of academic excellence finally began to shift the social dynamics around him. As Napoleon's intellectual gifts became undeniable, some classmates began to seek his help with studies. But by then, the damage was done. His neural pathways had learned to interpret these approaches not as genuine friendship, but as confirmation that power was the only currency that mattered in human relationships. The most tragic aspect of these early experiences was how they corrupted Napoleon's natural capacity for connection. Letters home to his family reveal a boy capable of deep affection, loyalty, and even tenderness. But these emotional capacities were being systematically suppressed by a brain that had learned to associate vulnerability with danger. The anterior cingulate cortex, which in healthy development learns to balance emotional expression with social appropriateness, was instead learning to suppress emotional displays entirely. Napoleon was teaching himself to become emotionally invulnerable, not realizing that this same armor would later prevent him from forming the genuine alliances and trust that effective leadership requires. By the time Napoleon graduated from military school, his brain had fundamentally reorganized itself around a single organizing principle. Never again would he be powerless. Never again would others look down on him with contempt or dismissal. The neural pathways that should have developed around cooperation, empathy, and mutual respect had been hijacked by circuits focused on dominance, control, and the relentless pursuit of superiority. This wasn't conscious choice, it was neurological adaptation. A sensitive, intelligent child had been placed in an environment that taught his developing brain that other people were either obstacles to overcome or tools to be used. The capacity for genuine partnership and collaborative leadership had been sacrificed in favor of the ruthless efficiency that would later conquer Europe. The Corsican outcast was already gone. In his place stood something more dangerous, a brilliant mind that had learned to see human relationships as strategic games to be won rather than bonds to be cherished. The boy who had once cried for his homeland would grow into the man who would reshape the entire continent, driven by neural pathways carved deep by childhood rejection and the desperate, endless hunger to prove that he was never again powerless. By the time Napoleon emerged from military school, his brain had developed something extraordinary and terrifying: the neural architecture of tactical genius. But this wasn't natural talent. It was the product of years of isolation, forcing his mind to find patterns where others saw only chaos. At 16, Second Lieutenant Bonaparte was assigned to an artillery regiment in Valence. While other young officers spent their evenings drinking and socializing, Napoleon retreated to his quarters with maps, military treatises, and an almost obsessive need to understand the mechanics of warfare. His prefrontal cortex, already trained for hypervigilance through years of social rejection, now focused this intensity on military strategy. What happened next was a masterclass in neuroplasticity. The same brain regions that had learned to detect social threats and calculate social hierarchies began applying these skills to battlefield dynamics. The superior parietal lobule, responsible for spatial processing, worked in concert with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to create three-dimensional mental models of terrain, troop movements, and tactical possibilities. Napoleon's first real test came during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The port city had fallen to the British, and the French revolutionary forces were struggling to recapture it. Multiple generals had failed. The siege was becoming an embarrassment to the new republic. When Napoleon arrived as a mere captain of artillery, most commanders dismissed him as another inexperienced officer. But Napoleon's brain processed the battlefield differently than anyone else present. While senior officers debated traditional siege tactics, his mind was running complex calculations. The anterior cingulate cortex, hyperactive from years of social stress, was now channeling that same vigilance toward tactical analysis. He could see weaknesses in the British position that escaped more experienced eyes. The neurological key to Napoleon's tactical genius lay in his ability to hold multiple variables in active memory simultaneously. His working memory, enhanced by years of academic intensity, could track the positions, capabilities, and likely behaviors of dozens of units across a complex battlefield. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex had developed an unusual capacity for what neuroscientists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to rapidly shift between different conceptual representations of the same situation. At Toulon, Napoleon's brain made a connection that would define his entire approach to warfare. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified city directly, he positioned his artillery to dominate the harbor. His spatial reasoning told him that controlling the water meant controlling the supply lines. His understanding of human psychology told him that cutting off escape routes would force rapid surrender rather than prolonged resistance. The plan worked with devastating efficiency. The British fleet evacuated within days, and Toulon fell to the French. But more importantly for Napoleon's neurological development, his brain experienced a massive dopamine surge. The nucleus accumbens, already wired to associate dominance with pleasure, was flooded with reward chemicals. Victory didn't just feel good, it felt like the solution to every childhood wound of rejection and powerlessness. This neurochemical reward created a dangerous addiction. Napoleon's brain began craving the high of tactical triumph. The ventral tegmental area, which produces dopamine, became hyperactive whenever he encountered military challenges. What looked like strategic thinking from the outside was partially driven by the same reward-seeking mechanisms that drive gambling or drug addiction. The promotion to brigadier general that followed Toulon provided another crucial piece of neurological conditioning. Napoleon's anterior insula, which processes feelings of status and social ranking, finally experienced something it had been denied throughout childhood: recognition and respect. But because his brain had been wired through trauma, it couldn't simply enjoy this validation. Instead, it immediately began calculating how to achieve even greater heights of recognition. Napoleon's tactical methods revealed the unique wiring of his mind. Traditional generals relied on established formations and predictable strategies. Napoleon's brain, shaped by years of being the outsider, naturally thought in terms of disruption and surprise. The right hemisphere, responsible for creative and holistic thinking, worked in unprecedented coordination with the left hemisphere's logical and sequential processing. His famous principle of concentration, massing forces at the decisive point, wasn't just military doctrine. It was the neurological expression of a mind that had learned to focus all available resources on a single objective. The same hyperfocus that had carried him through isolation at military school now allowed him to identify the critical moment in battle when maximum pressure could shatter enemy resistance. But Napoleon's tactical genius came with a neurological cost. The constant state of hypervigilance required to process battlefield information was exhausting his stress response systems. Cortisol levels remained chronically elevated, and his amygdala never fully relaxed, even during periods of apparent calm. His brain was operating like a computer running at maximum capacity with no cooling system. The Italian campaign of 1796 revealed both the power and the pathology of Napoleon's neural adaptations. At 26, he was given command of the Army of Italy, a demoralized, poorly equipped force facing Austrian and Sardinian armies that vastly outnumbered them. Traditional military wisdom said the campaign was hopeless. Napoleon's brain, however, saw opportunity where others saw disaster. His ability to rapidly process multiple streams of information allowed him to identify moments of tactical advantage that lasted only hours or even minutes. At the Battle of Montanate, he recognized that the Austrian and Sardinian forces were poorly coordinated. His prefrontal cortex calculated that rapid movement could prevent them from combining their strength. The neurological basis of his success lay in something called temporal spatial integration. While most commanders thought in terms of static positions, Napoleon's brain processed battlefields as dynamic systems changing across time. The posterior parietal cortex, enhanced by years of spatial thinking, allowed him to visualize how current movements would affect future positions. More remarkably, his brain had developed an intuitive grasp of what modern military theorists call the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Napoleon's neural circuits could complete this cycle faster than his opponents. His sensory processing systems gathered information from multiple sources simultaneously. His pattern recognition capabilities identified threats and opportunities. His decision-making processes cut through complexity to focus on essential actions. And his executive function implemented decisions with remarkable speed. The psychological dimension of his tactical genius was equally important. Napoleon understood that warfare was as much about breaking the enemy's will as destroying their capacity to fight. His brain, trained through childhood to read social hierarchies and power dynamics, could identify the psychological pressure points of opposing commanders. At Lodi, when he personally aimed cannon at the retreating Austrian army, it wasn't just tactical necessity. Napoleon's brain recognized that demonstrating personal courage under fire would create a powerful psychological effect on both his own troops and the enemy. The mirror neuron systems in his soldiers' brains would unconsciously respond to his fearlessness, while the Austrian troops would see their opponents as supernaturally determined. But victory was changing Napoleon's brain in dangerous ways. Each triumph reinforced neural pathways that associated personal worth with dominance over others. The orbitofrontal cortex, responsible for evaluating consequences, was being overwhelmed by dopamine surges from success. His ability to accurately assess risks was being compromised by neurochemical addiction to victory. The most troubling development was in his theory of mind, his ability to understand how others think and feel. Napoleon's tactical brilliance came partly from his capacity to predict enemy behavior, but this skill was becoming purely instrumental. He could read people's motivations and reactions with uncanny accuracy, but only as tools for manipulation, rather than as grounds for empathy or genuine connection. His letters during the Italian campaign reveal a mind intoxicated by its own power. Napoleon wasn't just winning battles. He was reshaping reality through force of will. His brain was learning that conventional limitations, geography, logistics, politics, could be overcome through sheer intensity of focus and willingness to accept risks that terrified other commanders. The neurological tragedy was that these same adaptations that made him militarily brilliant were making him psychologically isolated. The hypervigilance that allowed him to process battlefield information also made it nearly impossible to relax or trust others. The tactical thinking that won campaigns treated human relationships as strategic problems to be solved rather than bonds to be cherished. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had not only conquered territory, he had conquered his own brain. The neural pathways that had once fired in response to social rejection were now firing in response to military challenges. The amygdala that had once detected threats from schoolyard bullies was now calculating the weaknesses of enemy generals. The military genius was fully awake, but it had consumed the boy who had once written homesick letters to his family. In his place stood something more dangerous, a mind that had learned to find meaning only in the moment of victory, in the instant when superior strategy crushed opposing will. Napoleon's brain had solved the problem of powerlessness by becoming addicted to power itself. Paris, in 1799, was a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The French Revolution had devoured its own children. Robespierre had fallen to the guillotine, the Directory was corrupt and ineffective, and the streets buzzed with rumors of conspiracy. Into this psychological vacuum stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, his brain now fully adapted to recognize and exploit moments of collective vulnerability. The coup of 18 Brumaire wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a masterclass in applied neuroscience, a demonstration of how one brilliant, ruthless mind could manipulate the fear centers of an entire nation. Napoleon's brain, shaped by years of tactical thinking and social calculation, had identified the perfect psychological moment to seize absolute power. The neurological foundation for Napoleon's political genius lay in his enhanced ability to read group psychology. His superior temporal sulcus, responsible for processing social information, had been hyperactivated since childhood. But now, instead of scanning for threats in a military academy dormitory, it was analyzing the collective mood of French society with surgical precision. Napoleon understood something that most politicians missed. People in crisis don't want complex solutions. They want decisive leadership that promises safety. His brain, wired through trauma to associate powerlessness with danger, recognized the same pattern in French society. The amygdala of an entire nation was hyperactive, scanning constantly for threats both internal and external. The Directory had failed because its leaders still thought in terms of rational governance and political process. Napoleon's brain, shaped by years of battlefield command, thought in terms of psychological dominance and the manipulation of fear. While other politicians debated constitutional procedures, he was calculating how to trigger the collective stress response of key political figures and redirect it toward his own advantage. The coup began with classic Napoleonic misdirection. He convinced his fellow conspirators, Sieyès, Ducos, and his own brother Lucien, that he was merely their military instrument, a sword to be wielded by wiser civilian hands. But Napoleon's prefrontal cortex was already several moves ahead, planning how to eliminate his supposed allies once power was within reach. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon's brain demonstrated its most dangerous capability, the ability to remain calm under extreme psychological pressure while simultaneously orchestrating chaos around him. When he entered the Council of 500, the legislative body that stood between him and absolute power, his autonomic nervous system was regulated, while everyone else's was in complete disorder. The scene that followed revealed Napoleon's mastery of what neuroscientists call emotional contagion. His very presence in the chamber triggered a cascade of stress responses among the legislators. Their amygdalae fired in response to the implied threat of military force, while their prefrontal cortexes, responsible for rational decision-making, were overwhelmed by fight-or-flight activation. Napoleon's brain was processing this collective panic with cold, analytical precision. His mirror neuron systems were reading the micro-expressions, body language, and vocal tones of dozens of politicians simultaneously. He could see exactly how far he could push before resistance crystallized into organized opposition. But then something unexpected happened. Something that revealed both the power and the fragility of Napoleon's neurological adaptations. When several legislators began shouting, "Down with the dictator," and physically threatened him, his own stress response finally activated. For a moment, the hyper-controlled, calculating brain that had conquered Italy experienced something close to panic. The crucial neurological moment came when Napoleon was pushed and grabbed by hostile legislators. His amygdala, primed by decades of hypervigilance, flooded his system with stress hormones. For the first time in years, Napoleon experienced the helplessness that his entire psychological architecture had been built to avoid. His face went pale, he stumbled, and for a terrifying instant, the master manipulator became just another frightened human being. This moment of vulnerability could have destroyed him. But Napoleon's brain had developed something remarkable over years of military command: the ability to rapidly recalibrate under extreme stress. His prefrontal cortex managed to override the amygdala's panic response and identify the one person in the room whose stress response he could manipulate to his advantage: his brother Lucien, who was presiding over the session. What happened next was a demonstration of how Napoleon's brain could weaponize family bonds for political gain. He didn't appeal to Lucien's reason or political judgment. He triggered his protective instincts. Napoleon's anterior insula, which processes emotional bonds, sent signals that activated the same region in Lucien's brain. The neurological reality of their childhood connection overrode political considerations. Lucien's response was neurologically predictable. Faced with the choice between political principle and family loyalty, his brain's attachment systems won. He dissolved the legislative session and called in the military to clear the chamber. The coup was complete, but the psychological cost to Napoleon was enormous. The success of the coup created a massive reorganization in Napoleon's reward systems. The dopamine surge from seizing ultimate power was unlike anything he had previously experienced. Military victories had provided temporary satisfaction, but political dominance offered something his brain had been seeking since childhood: the complete elimination of the possibility of rejection or powerlessness. But this neurochemical triumph came with a hidden cost. Napoleon's brain began to conflate personal validation with political control. The orbitofrontal cortex, responsible for evaluating the long-term consequences of actions, was being overwhelmed by the immediate gratification of absolute authority. His ability to accurately assess the sustainability of his position was being compromised by addiction to the feeling of omnipotence. The establishment of the consulate revealed how Napoleon's brain had learned to manipulate democratic institutions while systematically dismantling them. His approach wasn't the crude authoritarianism of a military dictator. It was the subtle psychological manipulation of a mind that understood exactly how to make tyranny feel like liberation. Napoleon's first masterstroke was constitutional. Instead of abolishing the Republic, he claimed to be perfecting it. His brain had calculated that the French people's attachment to revolutionary ideals was still strong enough to resist obvious dictatorship, but weak enough to accept disguised authoritarianism if it promised stability and glory. The plebiscite that ratified his position as first consul was a neurological experiment conducted on a national scale. Napoleon's brain had identified that people experiencing chronic stress, which described most French citizens after a decade of revolution, have impaired decision-making capacity. Their prefrontal cortexes were exhausted from years of uncertainty, making them vulnerable to anyone who promised clear, simple solutions. The vote wasn't really about democracy. It was about providing a population in psychological crisis with the neurochemical relief of surrendering responsibility to someone who projected absolute confidence. Napoleon's brain had learned that most people would trade freedom for the promise of security, especially if the trade could be framed as patriotic rather than servile. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Napoleon's rise to power was how it changed his relationship with truth itself. His brain, now adapted to constant manipulation and strategic deception, began to lose the capacity to distinguish between tactical lies and actual reality. The same neural flexibility that made him a brilliant strategist was making him psychologically unstable. Napoleon's prefrontal cortex was becoming so focused on controlling others' perceptions that it was losing track of objective facts. When he proclaimed that the coup had saved the Republic, part of his brain actually believed this narrative, even while other parts were calculating how to eliminate the last vestiges of Republican government. This wasn't conscious hypocrisy. It was a form of neurological compartmentalization where different brain regions operated with incompatible beliefs simultaneously. The same mind that could calculate political probabilities with mathematical precision was capable of self-deception on a massive scale when those calculations challenged his fundamental need for psychological security. The most dangerous development was in Napoleon's theory of mind, his understanding of how other people thought and felt. His brain had become so sophisticated at predicting and manipulating others' behavior that he began to see people not as autonomous individuals, but as neurological systems to be hacked. This reductive view of human nature made Napoleon incredibly effective at short-term manipulation, but blind to the long-term consequences of treating people as instruments rather than persons. His brain could predict how French citizens would respond to propaganda, but it couldn't understand that sustained manipulation would eventually generate its own resistance. The seizure of power had revealed the full scope of Napoleon's neurological transformation. The rejected Corsican boy had become something unprecedented, a mind capable of reading and manipulating the collective psychology of an entire civilization. But in learning to control others so completely, he had lost the ability to understand them as anything more than obstacles to overcome or tools to employ. The coup of 18 Brumaire wasn't just the moment when Napoleon seized political power, it was the moment when power seized Napoleon's brain, beginning the final corruption of whatever capacity for genuine human connection still remained in his neurological architecture. The coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French on December 2nd, 1804, wasn't just a political ceremony. It was the culmination of the most dramatic neurological transformation in recorded history. In the span of 35 years, a brain that had once fired in response to childhood humiliation was now orchestrating its own deification in front of the entire civilized world. Standing in Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon made a decision that revealed the complete reorganization of his reality testing systems. Instead of allowing Pope Pius VII to place the crown on his head, he seized it and crowned himself. This wasn't mere political theater. It was the external manifestation of a brain that had lost the ability to recognize any authority higher than its own will. The neurological foundation for this grandiosity lay in the catastrophic inflation of Napoleon's self-referential processing networks. The medial prefrontal cortex, which normally maintains a balanced sense of self in relation to others, had become hyperactive and disconnected from external feedback systems. Years of military and political success had created neural pathways that interpreted every event through the lens of personal destiny and superiority. Napoleon's brain had developed what neuroscientists recognize as a pathological form of self-serving bias. The left hemisphere, responsible for creating coherent narratives about experience, was working overtime to construct a story in which every victory confirmed his exceptional nature, while every setback was explained as temporary interference with his inevitable triumph. The most dangerous aspect of this neurological shift was how it affected his risk assessment capabilities. The orbitofrontal cortex, responsible for evaluating consequences and learning from mistakes, was being overwhelmed by dopamine surges from grandiose thinking. Napoleon's brain was becoming addicted to the neurochemical high of believing himself invincible, making it increasingly difficult to process information that contradicted this intoxicating self-image. The creation of the imperial court revealed how completely Napoleon's social cognition had been corrupted. His brain, which had once been hypervigilant to threats and rejection, now interpreted subservience as natural and opposition as incomprehensible madness. The anterior cingulate cortex, which should have detected the artificiality of courtly worship, instead processed the elaborate ceremonies as confirmation of his inherent superiority. Napoleon's relationship with his marshals and advisors demonstrated the complete breakdown of his capacity for genuine partnership. His theory of mind, his ability to understand others' perspectives, had become purely instrumental. He could predict their behavior with uncanny accuracy, but only as a chess player predicts the movement of pieces, not as one human being understanding another. The neurological tragedy was that Napoleon's brain retained its extraordinary analytical capabilities while losing all capacity for self-reflection. He could dissect the motivations and weaknesses of foreign diplomats with surgical precision, but he couldn't recognize the growing disconnect between his self-perception and reality. His metacognitive systems, the brain regions responsible for thinking about thinking, had been hijacked by grandiose delusions. This manifested most clearly in his approach to European politics. Napoleon's brain processed international relations as a grand chess game in which he was the only player capable of seeing the entire board. The idea that other rulers might have legitimate interests or concerns that didn't revolve around his own ambitions became literally unthinkable. The continental system, his economic blockade of Britain, revealed the dangerous interaction between tactical brilliance and delusional thinking. Napoleon's prefrontal cortex could calculate complex economic relationships and predict trade patterns with remarkable accuracy. But his grandiose self-image made it impossible to recognize that other European powers might eventually choose economic ruin over permanent subservience to French interests. The most troubling development was in Napoleon's relationship with feedback and criticism. His brain had developed sophisticated defense mechanisms that automatically filtered out information challenging his self-image. The anterior insula, which processes social feedback, was being overridden by reward circuits that interpreted any form of disagreement as evidence of others' inferiority rather than valid critique. This neurological filtering system created a dangerous echo chamber. Napoleon surrounded himself with advisors whose primary qualification was their willingness to confirm his preconceptions. His brain, now addicted to validation, couldn't tolerate the stress of genuine intellectual challenge. The very hypervigilance that had once made him sensitive to threats was now being used to detect and eliminate sources of uncomfortable truth. The relationship with Josephine during this period revealed the personal cost of Napoleon's neurological transformation. His brain retained the capacity for intense attachment, but it could no longer distinguish between love and possession. The same neural circuits that processed military conquest were now being applied to romantic relationships. Napoleon's letters to Josephine during their courtship had shown genuine vulnerability and emotional openness. But as emperor, his communications became increasingly controlling and demanding. His brain couldn't comprehend that love might require respecting another person's autonomy rather than dominating their will. The tragedy was that Josephine's inability to provide an heir triggered the same abandonment fears that had shaped Napoleon's childhood. But instead of experiencing these emotions consciously, his brain processed them through the filter of imperial necessity. The divorce wasn't framed as personal loss, but as dynastic obligation, allowing him to avoid confronting the emotional devastation of another rejection. The marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 represented the complete triumph of political calculation over human feeling. Napoleon's brain could analyze the diplomatic benefits of the alliance with mathematical precision. But it had lost the capacity to recognize that treating marriage as a strategic arrangement rather than an emotional bond would leave him psychologically isolated at the moment when he most needed genuine connection. The birth of his son, the King of Rome, triggered another massive reorganization in Napoleon's reward systems. The child wasn't just his heir, he was living proof of Napoleon's ability to reshape reality through force of will. His brain processed fatherhood not as an opportunity for selfless love, but as confirmation of his genetic superiority and dynastic destiny. This neurochemical triumph created the most dangerous delusion of all, the belief that he could control the future as completely as he had controlled the past. Napoleon's brain began planning not just for his own reign, but for a Bonaparte dynasty that would rule Europe for centuries. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for realistic planning, was being overwhelmed by grandiose fantasies that bore no relationship to political reality. The most revealing aspect of Napoleon's delusions was how they affected his understanding of historical patterns. His brain could analyze the rise and fall of previous empires with remarkable insight, but it couldn't apply these lessons to his own situation. The same intellectual brilliance that had made him a master strategist was being used to construct elaborate rationalizations for why historical precedents didn't apply to his unique case. This selective blindness extended to his understanding of French society itself. Napoleon's brain could calculate the economic benefits of his wars and the administrative efficiency of his government, but it couldn't recognize that the French people's enthusiasm for conquest was being gradually replaced by war weariness and longing for peace. The neurological irony was that the same hypervigilance that had made Napoleon sensitive to social dynamics in his youth was now being used to maintain psychological defenses against uncomfortable truths. His brain had become so sophisticated at detecting and neutralizing threats to his self-image that it had lost the capacity to process legitimate warnings about the sustainability of his empire. By 1810, Napoleon had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the complete neurological fusion of personal identity with political power. His brain could no longer distinguish between threats to his empire and threats to his psychological survival. Any challenge to French dominance was processed as a personal attack, requiring immediate and overwhelming retaliation. The emperor's delusion was complete. The rejected Corsican boy had constructed a neurological fortress so impenetrable that not even reality itself could breach its walls. But this same fortress that protected him from psychological pain was also preventing him from recognizing the gathering storm that would soon destroy everything he had built. By 1805, Napoleon's brain had developed something far more dangerous than tactical genius or political cunning. It had become neurochemically dependent on warfare itself. Peace wasn't just boring or diplomatically inconvenient. It was literally unbearable for a nervous system that had rewired itself around the cycle of threat, mobilization, conflict, and victory. The neurological foundation for this addiction lay in the complete hijacking of Napoleon's dopamine reward pathways. The ventral tegmental area, which normally responds to basic pleasures like food, sex, or social connection, now fired most intensely during the preparation and execution of military campaigns. His brain had learned that the complex orchestration of armies, the calculation of strategic possibilities, and the ultimate triumph over enemies provided the deepest form of neurochemical satisfaction available to human consciousness. This wasn't conscious choice. It was biological dependency. Napoleon's brain had developed tolerance to ordinary sources of reward. The same neural mechanisms that drive gambling addiction or substance abuse were now focused on conquest. He needed increasingly dramatic military challenges to achieve the same neurochemical high that smaller victories had once provided. The Battle of Austerlitz on December 2nd, 1805, revealed both the magnificent power and the terrible pathology of Napoleon's war addiction. His tactical performance that day was arguably the greatest single display of military genius in recorded history. His brain processed the movements of 180,000 men across miles of terrain with the precision of a grandmaster playing chess. But the psychological cost was enormous. Standing on the Pratzen Heights as Austrian and Russian forces collapsed before his coordinated assault, Napoleon experienced something approaching a neurological orgasm. Every neural pathway that had been carved by childhood rejection, academic isolation, and years of tactical study fired in perfect synchronization. The dopamine surge was so intense that his brain interpreted the moment as the ultimate validation of his entire existence. But like any addiction, the high was temporary, and the crash was devastating. Within weeks of Austerlitz, Napoleon's brain was already craving the next fix. Peace negotiations weren't opportunities for consolidation, they were unbearable periods of neurochemical withdrawal. His prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-term planning, was being overwhelmed by limbic systems screaming for the next campaign. The most dangerous aspect of Napoleon's war addiction was how it corrupted his strategic thinking. His brain retained its extraordinary analytical capabilities, but they were now being used primarily to rationalize decisions driven by neurochemical craving rather than rational assessment of French interests. The invasion of Prussia in 1806 demonstrated this perfectly. Napoleon's conscious mind constructed elaborate justifications based on Prussian provocations and the need to complete the destruction of the Third Coalition. But his brain's deeper motivation was simpler and more primitive. He needed another war because peace felt like psychological death. At Jena and Auerstedt, Napoleon achieved another stunning double victory, crushing Prussian forces so completely that the vaunted military state of Frederick the Great essentially ceased to exist. But instead of providing lasting satisfaction, each triumph only increased his neurochemical tolerance. His brain was learning that total victory over one enemy merely created space for the next challenge. The neurological tragedy was that Napoleon's war addiction was destroying his capacity for the very strategic thinking that made him successful. The orbitofrontal cortex, responsible for evaluating consequences and learning from experience, was being systematically undermined by dopamine-seeking behavior. He could still analyze individual battles with brilliant precision, but he was losing the ability to assess whether wars themselves served any coherent purpose. This became most apparent in his relationship with the other European powers. Napoleon's brain processed diplomacy not as a tool for achieving sustainable political arrangements, but as a temporary inconvenience between more satisfying military confrontations. Treaties were neurological torture, periods of forced inactivity that prevented access to the reward systems that had become central to his psychological survival. The continental system revealed how completely his strategic thinking had been corrupted by addiction. What began as a rational economic strategy to defeat Britain gradually became an obsessive need to control every aspect of European commerce. Napoleon's brain couldn't tolerate the idea that any nation might trade independently of his will, not because of economic logic, but because independence represented a form of resistance that triggered his deepest psychological vulnerabilities. The invasion of Spain in 1808 marked the point where Napoleon's war addiction began to override even basic military sense. His conscious mind constructed rational arguments about strategic necessity and dynastic legitimacy. But the deeper neurological truth was simpler. He needed another war, and Spain provided the most convenient target. The Peninsula War demonstrated the catastrophic interaction between tactical brilliance and addictive thinking. Napoleon's brain could still calculate battlefield advantages with extraordinary precision, but it had lost the capacity to recognize when military force was being applied to problems that couldn't be solved through violence. Spanish guerrilla warfare created a nightmare scenario for Napoleon's reward-seeking neural pathways. Traditional battles provided clear victory conditions that triggered massive dopamine releases. But guerrilla conflict offered no decisive moments, no climactic confrontations, no satisfying conclusions. His brain was trapped in a cycle of perpetual craving without the possibility of neurochemical relief. The psychological cost was enormous. Napoleon's stress response systems, already overloaded from years of constant campaign, began showing signs of serious dysfunction. His sleep patterns became erratic, his mood swings more extreme, and his decision-making increasingly impulsive. The same hypervigilance that had once made him sensitive to tactical opportunities was now being triggered by minor diplomatic slights and imaginary threats. Perhaps most dangerously, Napoleon's war addiction was affecting his relationship with his own army. His brain had learned to see soldiers not as human beings, with families and fears, but as instruments for achieving neurochemical satisfaction. The casualties that once troubled him now barely registered as long as they contributed to victory. This dehumanization extended to his marshals and generals. Men who had served him faithfully for years found themselves being treated as disposable assets rather than trusted partners. Napoleon's brain could no longer process loyalty and sacrifice as gifts deserving gratitude. They were simply expected inputs in his war-making machine. The most revealing aspect of his addiction was how it affected his understanding of French interests. Napoleon's conscious mind continued to frame his wars as necessary for French security and prosperity. But his brain's deeper motivation had become completely divorced from national benefit. France existed to support his war-making, not the reverse. The economic strain of constant warfare was destroying French society, but Napoleon's brain processed these costs as acceptable sacrifices for the greater goal of continued conquest. His ability to accurately assess the relationship between military success and political stability was being undermined by neurochemical dependency on the very conflicts that were draining French resources. By 1810, Napoleon's war addiction had created a tragic paradox. He remained arguably the greatest military tactician in history, but his strategic judgment had been completely corrupted. His brain could win any individual battle, but had lost the capacity to understand what winning was supposed to achieve. The addiction also created a temporal distortion in his thinking. Napoleon's brain became focused almost exclusively on the immediate gratification of military challenge, losing the ability to think seriously about long-term consequences. The same mind that could calculate the movement of armies months in advance couldn't recognize that constant warfare was making his empire politically unsustainable. The most chilling aspect of Napoleon's war addiction was its self-reinforcing nature. Each victory made peace more unbearable. Each conquest made the next war more necessary. Each triumph raised the stakes for the next confrontation. His brain had trapped him in an accelerating cycle where the only escape from war was more war. The rejected Corsican boy who had once dreamed of military glory had become something far more dangerous, a brilliant mind held hostage by its own reward systems, capable of extraordinary tactical achievement, but incapable of recognizing that its addiction was destroying everything it claimed to protect. War had become Napoleon's master, and Europe would pay the price for his neurochemical enslavement. In the autumn of 1795, a 26-year-old artillery officer encountered a woman who would trigger the most profound neurological disruption of his adult life. Josephine de Beauharnais wasn't just another conquest for Napoleon's calculating mind. She was a direct assault on the emotional fortress he had spent decades constructing around his wounded psyche. The first meeting at a salon in Paris activated neural pathways that had been dormant since Napoleon's childhood. His brain, so precisely calibrated for tactical analysis and social manipulation, suddenly found itself flooded with neurochemicals it couldn't control or predict. The anterior cingulate cortex, which had learned to process most human interactions as strategic opportunities, was overwhelmed by genuine emotional attachment. Josephine represented everything Napoleon's traumatized psychology had taught him to distrust. She was 6 years older, sexually experienced, financially independent, and completely unimpressed by his military achievements. Her brain operated with the confident social fluency that his had never developed. Where Napoleon calculated and strategized, Josephine simply existed with effortless charm and natural magnetism. The neurological impact was catastrophic to Napoleon's carefully maintained emotional control. The same brain that could orchestrate the movement of armies found itself helpless against the simple reality of romantic attachment. His letters to Josephine during their courtship reveal a mind in complete neurochemical chaos, desperate, vulnerable, and terrifyingly human. "I wake filled with you," he wrote. "Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." These weren't the calculated words of a strategic mind. They were the raw expressions of neural pathways that had been activated for the first time since childhood. The ventral tegmental area was flooding his system with dopamine, while the anterior insula processed attachment with an intensity that overwhelmed his prefrontal cortex's attempts at emotional regulation. But Josephine's power over Napoleon went deeper than simple romantic attraction. She represented the resolution of his most fundamental psychological wound, the fear of abandonment that had shaped every neural pathway since his father's betrayal and his exile to military school. For the first time in his adult life, Napoleon's brain experienced what it felt like to be chosen by someone who had other options. The marriage in 1796 created a profound reorganization in Napoleon's reward systems. His brain, so precisely calibrated for dominance and control, now found its deepest satisfaction in moments of intimate connection. The oxytocin and vasopressin systems, responsible for pair bonding, had been largely suppressed since childhood, but were now flooding his neural architecture with unfamiliar but intoxicating neurochemicals. The tragedy was that Napoleon's brain didn't know how to process healthy attachment. His neural pathways had been carved by experiences of betrayal, rejection, and abandonment. Even as he experienced genuine love for Josephine, his amygdala remained hypervigilant for signs of infidelity or emotional withdrawal. The same hypervigilance that made him a tactical genius made him a tormented lover. His obsessive jealousy wasn't just psychological insecurity, it was neurological inevitability. The anterior insula, which processes trust and attachment, was constantly being overridden by amygdala activation, triggered by any sign of Josephine's independence. Napoleon's brain literally couldn't distinguish between her natural social charm and evidence of betrayal. The Italian campaign of 1796 revealed the full scope of this neurological disruption. Napoleon was simultaneously conducting the most brilliant military campaign of his career while experiencing complete emotional breakdown over his separation from Josephine. His letters from this period show a mind torn between tactical genius and romantic obsession. "You are the constant object of my thoughts," he wrote from Lodi. "My imagination exhausts itself in guessing what you are doing." The same prefrontal cortex that was calculating Austrian weaknesses and coordinating complex troop movements was also spinning elaborate fantasies about Josephine's activities in Paris. The neurochemical conflict was extraordinary. Napoleon's brain was experiencing simultaneous addiction to both military victory and romantic attachment. The dopamine pathways that fired during tactical triumph were competing with the oxytocin systems activated by thoughts of Josephine. His neural architecture was being pulled in incompatible directions, creating a form of psychological tension that would define their entire relationship. Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign triggered the most devastating neurological crisis of his adult life. The discovery didn't just wound his pride, it shattered the fundamental neural reorganization that had occurred around their attachment. The posterior cingulate cortex, which had learned to process Josephine as a source of safety and validation, suddenly had to recategorize her as a source of threat and betrayal. The psychological damage was compounded by the fact that Napoleon learned of the affair through gossip and newspaper reports, rather than direct confrontation. His brain had to process the betrayal while maintaining the facade of military command. The anterior cingulate cortex was simultaneously managing the emotional pain of abandonment while coordinating the logistics of the Egyptian expedition. Napoleon's response revealed both the depth of his attachment and the pathological nature of his coping mechanisms. Instead of confronting his emotional devastation directly, his brain channeled the pain into military aggression. The Battle of the Pyramids wasn't just tactical brilliance, it was emotional sublimation on a massive scale. But the most psychologically significant aspect of the crisis was Napoleon's decision to forgive Josephine upon his return to France. This wasn't magnanimity, it was neurological dependency. His brain had become so fundamentally reorganized around their attachment that severing the bond felt like psychological death. The sunk cost fallacy was operating at a neurochemical level. The reconciliation created a new and even more destructive dynamic in their relationship. Napoleon's brain had learned that Josephine was capable of betrayal, but it hadn't learned to detach from her. Instead, his neural pathways developed increasingly sophisticated monitoring and control systems designed to prevent future infidelity. The same tactical thinking that made Napoleon a military genius was now being applied to romantic surveillance. His brain processed Josephine's social interactions through the lens of threat assessment, constantly calculating the probability of renewed betrayal. Love had become another form of warfare, requiring constant vigilance and strategic manipulation. The coronation as emperor in 1804 marked the beginning of the final phase of their neurological dance. Napoleon's brain had achieved the ultimate validation of his worthiness. He was literally the most powerful man in Europe. But instead of providing security in his relationship with Josephine, imperial status created new sources of anxiety. His brain began processing their childlessness not just as personal disappointment, but as dynastic crisis. The same neural pathways that had learned to associate personal worth with achievement now demanded biological proof of his genetic superiority. Josephine's inability to provide an heir triggered the abandonment fears that had never fully healed from childhood. The divorce in 1809 represented the triumph of political calculation over emotional attachment, but the neurological cost was enormous. Napoleon's brain had spent 14 years reorganizing itself around the reality of genuine human connection. The conscious decision to sever this bond for dynastic purposes created a form of self-inflicted psychological amputation. His letters to Josephine after the divorce reveal a mind struggling to process loss that couldn't be resolved through victory or conquest. "You know well that I can never forget you," he wrote. "I shall always preserve the sweetest and most tender memories of our union." But these weren't just sentimental expressions. They were descriptions of neural pathways that had been too deeply carved to disappear through conscious decision. The marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria was Napoleon's attempt to replace emotional attachment with political alliance. His brain approached the new relationship with the same strategic thinking that had conquered Europe. But neurochemical bonding can't be manufactured through rational calculation. Marie-Louise triggered none of the overwhelming attachment responses that had characterized his relationship with Josephine. His brain processed the marriage as successful policy implementation rather than genuine human connection. The birth of the King of Rome provided the heir he had demanded, but it couldn't fill the neurological void left by the loss of his first love. The tragedy was that Napoleon's brain had learned the wrong lesson from his experience with Josephine. Instead of recognizing that vulnerability and genuine connection were sources of strength, his neural pathways concluded that emotional attachment was a form of weakness that compromised strategic thinking. The man who would conquer Europe and reshape the modern world had been defeated by his inability to understand that love requires the very thing his traumatized psychology made impossible: the willingness to remain vulnerable in the presence of someone who has the power to wound you. Josephine had shown Napoleon what his brain was capable of feeling, but his psychological architecture couldn't sustain the neurological revolution she had triggered. In choosing empire over love, he had preserved his strategic capabilities while amputating the part of his humanity that made victory meaningful. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 wasn't born from strategic necessity or political calculation. It emerged from the complete neurological breakdown of Napoleon's reality testing systems. His brain, now fatally compromised by grandiosity, addiction to conquest, and decades of unchallenged dominance, could no longer distinguish between tactical possibility and megalomaniacal fantasy. Standing before maps of the Russian Empire in the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon's prefrontal cortex processed the invasion as merely another campaign to be won through superior planning and execution. But deeper neural systems were driving the decision through pathways carved by childhood trauma and reinforced by 20 years of military triumph. Russia represented the ultimate validation, the conquest of the unconquerable, the final proof that his will could reshape any reality. The neurological irony was devastating. Napoleon retained his extraordinary capacity for tactical analysis, but his strategic judgment had been completely corrupted by dopamine addiction and grandiose delusions. He could calculate supply lines, analyze terrain, and predict enemy movements with brilliant precision. But he couldn't recognize that he was about to lead 600,000 men into a trap created by his own psychological compulsions. The Grande Armée that crossed the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, represented the apotheosis of Napoleon's military genius and the instrument of his neurological destruction. His brain processed the massive force as confirmation of his power to will armies into existence, but it couldn't comprehend that size alone wouldn't overcome the fundamental strategic impossibility of conquering a nation that could retreat indefinitely into its own vastness. The early weeks of the campaign revealed how completely Napoleon's pattern recognition systems had been compromised by grandiose thinking. His brain expected Russian resistance to follow the familiar European model: organized armies defending strategic positions that could be seized through tactical brilliance. When Russian forces simply melted away before his advance, his neural pathways couldn't process what was happening. The same mind that had revolutionized warfare through rapid movement and concentrated force found itself pursuing shadows across an endless landscape. Napoleon's brain, calibrated for decisive confrontation, was being tortured by an enemy that refused to provide the clear victory conditions necessary for neurochemical satisfaction. The dopamine-seeking systems that drove his war addiction were trapped in a state of perpetual craving, without the possibility of release. The Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, represented both the peak of Napoleon's tactical achievement and the beginning of his psychological collapse. His brain orchestrated one of the bloodiest single days in military history with technical mastery, but the Pyrrhic victory triggered a cascade of stress responses that would never fully resolve. Standing among 70,000 casualties, Napoleon experienced something his neural architecture wasn't prepared to process: victory that felt like defeat. The dopamine surge he expected from tactical triumph was overwhelmed by stress hormones from witnessing unprecedented carnage. His reward systems, so precisely calibrated to fire after successful battles, misfired catastrophically when presented with success purchased at apocalyptic cost. The march to Moscow revealed the full scope of Napoleon's neurological vulnerability. His brain had been wired since childhood to interpret control over environment as psychological safety. But Russia was teaching him that there were spaces too vast, populations too numerous, and forces too fundamental to be controlled through individual will, no matter how brilliant or determined. Entering the empty, burning city of Moscow on September 14th, Napoleon experienced the most profound reality-testing failure of his life. His brain had expected conquest of the Russian capital to trigger the familiar neurochemical cascade of triumph and validation. Instead, he found himself master of a ghost city that mocked every assumption his neural pathways had made about the relationship between victory and satisfaction. The 5 weeks Napoleon spent waiting in Moscow for a Russian surrender that would never come marked the beginning of his complete psychological breakdown. His brain, desperate for the resolution that addiction demanded, continued to calculate scenarios in which Alexander I would recognize the inevitable and negotiate. But deeper neural systems were beginning to process the unprecedented reality that his will had encountered something it couldn't dominate. The retreat that began on October 19th was more than military disaster. It was the systematic destruction of every neurological adaptation that had made Napoleon who he was. His brain had been organized around the assumption that superior planning, tactical brilliance, and force of will could overcome any obstacle. The Russian winter was teaching him that some realities were indifferent to human genius. The collapse of the Grande Armée represented the external manifestation of Napoleon's internal neurological crisis. As his soldiers died by the thousands from cold, hunger, and disease, his brain was forced to process the complete failure of every psychological system that had sustained him since childhood. The hypervigilance that had made him sensitive to tactical opportunities was now detecting nothing but endless threat. The pattern recognition systems that had revolutionized warfare could find no patterns in the chaos of retreat. The reward pathways that had driven his conquests were triggering only in response to moments of temporary survival. The crossing of the Berezina River in November marked the nadir of Napoleon's psychological destruction. His brain, which had once coordinated the movement of armies with mathematical precision, was now struggling to maintain basic executive function under the assault of unprecedented stress. The prefrontal cortex was being overwhelmed by amygdala activation triggered by constant threat to survival. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the retreat was how it shattered Napoleon's theory of mind, his understanding of how other people thought and felt. For 20 years, his brain had processed soldiers as instruments of his will, responding predictably to leadership and inspiration. But starving, freezing men follow different neural algorithms than healthy troops. His psychological models of human behavior were proving catastrophically inadequate. The Cossack raids that harassed the retreating army weren't just military tactics. They were psychological warfare, conducted against a mind that had never learned to process sustained helplessness. Napoleon's brain, calibrated for dominance and control, was being subjected to a form of learned helplessness that corroded his most fundamental assumptions about his own capabilities. By the time Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris in December, his neural architecture had undergone irreversible damage. The same mind that had conquered Europe was now carrying the neurological scars of complete strategic failure. His stress response systems were permanently hyperactivated, his reality testing mechanisms were compromised, and his addictive craving for military triumph was tainted by the memory of ultimate defeat. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the Russian catastrophe was that Napoleon's tactical abilities remained intact while his strategic judgment had been shattered. He could still read battlefields with brilliant insight, but he had lost the capacity to accurately assess whether battles were worth fighting. His brain retained its genius for winning individual engagements while losing all wisdom about when to stop fighting entirely. The neurological irony was complete. The rejected Corsican boy, who had built his entire identity around the belief that will and intelligence could overcome any obstacle, had encountered the one enemy that couldn't be defeated through human effort: the indifferent vastness of natural forces that operated according to laws more fundamental than military genius. Russia had taught Napoleon's brain something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: there were limits to what individual will could achieve, boundaries that even the most brilliant mind couldn't transcend, and realities that remained stubbornly resistant to the human need for control and domination. The invincible emperor was broken, and his neural pathways would never fully recover from the lesson that even the most extraordinary human brain was still, ultimately, just another fragile biological system, vulnerable to forces beyond its comprehension or control. The man who stepped onto the rocky shores of St. Helena on October 15, 1815, bore little resemblance to the emperor who had once commanded the destiny of Europe. Napoleon's brain, scarred by the Russian catastrophe and shattered by the humiliation of Waterloo, was now beginning the final phase of its disintegration. The slow, agonizing process of a mind learning to exist without the neurochemical architecture that had defined its entire adult existence. Exile represented something far more devastating than political defeat or military failure. For Napoleon's neural pathways, carved deep by decades of command and conquest, isolation on St. Helena was a form of sensory deprivation that attacked the very foundations of his psychological survival. His brain had been wired to process constant streams of information, troop movements, diplomatic dispatches, strategic possibilities, and suddenly found itself trapped in a prison of enforced irrelevance. The neurological impact was immediate and catastrophic. The prefrontal cortex, which had spent 20 years coordinating the activities of armies and nations, was now reduced to managing the trivial details of life in a cramped house with a handful of servants. The same neural networks that had revolutionized European warfare were being forced to focus on gardening disputes and the arrangement of furniture. More devastating still was the complete collapse of Napoleon's dopamine reward systems. His brain had become addicted to the neurochemical surge of command decisions that affected millions of lives. The reduction to powerlessness over even his own daily routine triggered a form of withdrawal that manifested as deep depression, violent mood swings, and obsessive rumination about past glories. The most psychologically destructive aspect of exile was how it stripped away every defense mechanism that Napoleon's traumatized psyche had constructed since childhood. The hypervigilance that had made him sensitive to tactical opportunities found no threats worth monitoring. The pattern recognition systems that had decoded the intentions of emperors and generals were reduced to analyzing the motivations of British jailers and household staff. Napoleon's relationship with his captors revealed the complete breakdown of his theory of mind. His brain could no longer distinguish between legitimate authority and personal persecution. Every restriction was processed through neural pathways carved by childhood rejection and abandonment. The same amygdala activation that had once motivated military brilliance was now triggered by minor inconveniences and bureaucratic delays. The dictation of his memoirs represented both Napoleon's attempt to control his historical legacy and the manifestation of severe psychological fragmentation. His brain would spend hours reconstructing past campaigns with obsessive detail, as if perfect recall of tactical decisions could somehow reverse the reality of present helplessness. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for integrating past and present experience, was stuck in a loop that prevented psychological acceptance of his changed circumstances. But these reminiscences weren't accurate historical records. They were neurological reconstructions, filtered through decades of grandiose delusions and defensive rationalization. Napoleon's brain couldn't acknowledge genuine strategic errors without triggering overwhelming shame responses, so it constructed alternative narratives where every defeat was explained by betrayal, bad weather, or impossible odds rather than flawed judgment. The most revealing aspect of these reconstructions was how they demonstrated the complete breakdown of Napoleon's reality-testing capabilities. His brain could simultaneously maintain detailed memories of tactical events while being completely delusional about their broader significance. He could recall the exact timing of cavalry charges at Austerlitz while believing that his exile was a temporary inconvenience rather than permanent political death. The relationship with his companions in exile, particularly Count Bertrand and General Gourgaud, revealed the pathological nature of Napoleon's need for dominance, even in powerlessness. His brain processed these loyal followers not as friends offering comfort in isolation, but as subjects whose deference could provide temporary relief from the neurochemical withdrawal of lost authority. The petty tyrannies he imposed on his household weren't conscious cruelty, but unconscious attempts to reactivate reward pathways that had been dormant since Waterloo. When he manipulated conflicts between his companions or created artificial crises requiring his intervention, his brain was desperately trying to recreate the neurochemical conditions that had once provided meaning and satisfaction. The progressive deterioration of Napoleon's physical health mirrored the collapse of his psychological defenses. His brain, which had once regulated sleep, appetite, and energy with military precision, was now showing signs of severe dysregulation. Chronic insomnia reflected hyperactivated threat detection systems that couldn't recognize safety. Weight gain and lethargy indicated reward pathways that had lost their capacity for normal pleasure, seeking compensation through basic sensory gratification. The most psychologically devastating development was Napoleon's growing awareness of his own irrelevance. His brain retained enough analytical capacity to understand that Europe was reorganizing itself without reference to his opinions or desires. The Congress system that replaced his empire operated according to principles that explicitly rejected everything his neural architecture had been designed to achieve. This recognition triggered what neuroscientists would recognize as a form of existential learned helplessness. Napoleon's brain had spent 46 years developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for controlling his environment and dominating other people. The complete failure of these strategies on St. Helena created a neurological crisis that his psychological defenses couldn't resolve. The rumors of poisoning that obsessed Napoleon's final years weren't just paranoid delusions. They were his brain's attempt to maintain some sense of agency in the face of complete powerlessness. If he was being murdered by British agents, then his death would at least represent recognition of his continued importance. The alternative, that he was simply dying of mundane medical causes while the world moved on without him, was too psychologically devastating to process consciously. The gradual decline of his memory and cognitive function represented the final collapse of the neural architecture that had made him Napoleon. The same brain that had once held detailed tactical information about multiple battlefields simultaneously was now struggling to remember conversations from the previous day. The hippocampus, damaged by years of chronic stress and neurochemical addiction, was losing its capacity to encode new experiences into lasting memory. Perhaps most tragically, Napoleon retained enough self-awareness to recognize his own mental deterioration. His brain could still generate moments of brilliant analysis, but these flashes of former genius were separated by increasingly long periods of confusion and disorientation. The metacognitive systems that allowed him to think about thinking were now forced to observe their own dissolution. The final months of 1820 and early 1821 witnessed the systematic shutdown of every psychological system that had defined Napoleon's identity. His capacity for strategic thinking disappeared first, leaving only tactical analysis of increasingly trivial situations. His ability to inspire loyalty in others evaporated as his behavior became more erratic and demanding. Even his talent for manipulation was reduced to petty schemes that fooled no one and achieved nothing. The deathbed scene on May 5, 1821, represented the endpoint of the most dramatic neurological transformation in recorded history. The brain that had revolutionized warfare, reshaped European politics, and conquered most of a continent was finally releasing its desperate grip on the illusion of control that had sustained it through 5 decades of triumph and catastrophe. In his final delirium, Napoleon's brain retreated to the neural pathways carved deepest by experience, the memories of military command and tactical decision-making. His last coherent words reportedly involved giving orders to imaginary armies, as if his dying mind was seeking comfort in the neurochemical patterns that had once provided meaning and identity. The rejected Corsican boy who had rebuilt himself into the master of Europe died as he had lived since childhood, alone, fighting battles that existed only in his own mind, sustained by the grandiose delusions that had been both his greatest strength and his ultimate weakness. The brain that had changed the world had finally learned the lesson that all human consciousness must eventually confront: that individual will, no matter how brilliant or determined, remains subject to forces beyond its control, and that even the most extraordinary mind is ultimately just another biological system subject to the same inexorable processes of decay and death that govern all living things. Napoleon was dead, but the neural pathways he had carved through history, the modern understanding of merit-based advancement, national identity, legal codification, and strategic thinking, would outlive the biological brain that created them, proving that while individual consciousness is mortal, the patterns it creates in the world can achieve a form of immortality that transcends the limits of any single nervous system.